Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support the broadcast. Best way to do that is becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack, $5 a month or $50 a year. The new price, which is going to kick in on September 11th, is going to be $9.11 a month or $91.10 a year. But if you subscribe before that, you'll be grandfathered in with the old subscription. So think about that. And that's the best way to support Geopolitics and Empire. And I do members only stuff as well, private calls with the group every week, a weekly news commentary and roundup. And sometimes we bring back old guests to do a Q&A live with members only. And do check out this month's sponsor, the Expat Money Summit that's run by Mikkel Thorup. It's going to be online for free October 7th to the 11th. Most of the headline speakers have been guests on this podcast: Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Mark Faber, and many others. You can watch it for free. And if you can't catch it within the free 24 hours, you'll have to get the upgrade VIP ticket. If you use Empire promo code, you'll get $100 off. And do check out my affiliates. You can also donate to the podcast and purchase a consult to chat with me. Joining us for the first time at Geopolitics and Empire is Warwick Powell. He's an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology and a senior fellow at Taipei Institute, Beijing. He's also the chairman of Smart Trade Networks, and he's got a new website, multipolarpeace.com. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Warwick.
Happy to be with you.
I've been following your work for quite a while and reading your articles and analysis, and I enjoy it very much. And you can tell us in a bit about your new venture, multipolarpeace.com. You guys did a roundtable recently. I've interviewed a number of the folks on that roundtable, Jeff Rich, Jeffrey Gray on my old TNT radio program, as well as S.L. Canton, who's been a guest on the podcast. And I wanted to get your big picture take with what's happening in the world, East versus West. A lot is going on. It seems the wealth and influence of the West is rapidly declining and the East is rising. And all of this is happening in the shadow of a new Cold War and possibly a third World War. So, start wherever you'd like.
Well, some pretty big topics there. And look, I think that the issues of the political conflicts and the emerging military dimensions are largely symptoms of the underlying economic transformations that have been unfolding over not just the last few years, but over the last 40 to 50 years. And I say that because what we're starting to see now in the mid-2020s is, in some respects, what you could call the symptomology of underlying structural imbalances that have been materializing, particularly in the economies of the first world. So this is your traditional transatlantic economic powers, whether they are in Western Europe or North America. And the transformations that have been taking place has been the progressive financialization of their respective economic structures. And by that, I mean a growing dominance of the political economy of these economic systems in areas where wealth and value flows is taking place through the expansion of the circuits of exchange value that actually remain disconnected from the real economy of use value. So I've introduced some concepts already there, and we can explore what some of those mean. But basically, over the last 40 to 50 years, the economy, if you will, of monetized exchange value production and circulation has expanded at such a rate and to such an extent in the traditional Western powers that they have led to the hollowing out of the use value economy of the real economy. Now, the consequence of that is actually where the politics kicks in, because the consequence at a domestic level is growing income disparities. So we're starting to see the real evidence of how these structural transformations has led to the concentration of wealth in the hands of a smaller and smaller group of people, whether it's in the US or in Western Europe, and I include in that the UK. and at the same time, the progressive relative and also real impoverishment of a growing proportion of people. So these inequality dynamics driven by financialization underpins the political reactions at a domestic level. And we've seen some of that, of course, in the elections that have just taken place in Germany over the weekend. We saw the election results in the UK not so long ago. And of course, we watched the United States election with bated breath. Now, those changes that have been taking place at the political level in a domestic sense are also spilling over into the international environment, because the domestic imbalances that now exist have caused the elite establishment, the political elite, if you will, to try to focus national public attention on international issues. It's easier to blame others, remember, and to create common enemies that are external to your domestic body politic, so as to sustain the regimes of wealth accumulation that have become the dominant patterns in these places. So domestic imbalances driven by financialization, driving expansive inequality, undermining the political social license, underpinning, therefore, the international disruptions that we now see.
And one of the best indicators for me is how much does it cost to have a baby, a child? And here in Mexico, it costs $1,000, $1,500 maybe. And when I talk to people in the U.S., I can't believe the number that I get. They tell me the hospitals charge $30,000 to $40,000, which is obscene to bring a person into this world. And I think that's just one example of many regarding what you're talking about, this disparity. I've lived in Kazakhstan, and it's low wages there, but low cost of living, and so you get more bang for your buck in the global South. And I follow a lot of your work, and you're pointing out how, maybe to just go further on the economy aspect, we're seeing in the West, in Europe, in particular places like Germany, which are or were economic industrial powerhouses, they are rapidly disintegrating, deindustrializing. Also we're getting a high cost of living for the citizens in these countries. Meanwhile, places like China are advancing in the tech sphere, in the economic sphere. Could you sort of give us your view on what's happening in the West, what's happening in China, and where the real, economic development is happening, and who's leading when it comes to AI and some of these other technologies?
Sure. Let's see if we can tick them off one at a time. I think it's useful to sometimes go back to tours conceptually about what it is that we're talking about as far as economic systems are concerned. And I often try to arrive at a level of abstraction, if you will, that helps us grasp in very general terms what some of the key drivers are of the transformations that we see today, but also be able to contextualize them historically. And I tend to look at economic systems as basically energy transformation systems writ large. So we are, in effect, living in a material world where we, as human beings, interact with nature as a part of nature by harnessing existing energy. Bear in mind that there is only so much energy in the world. It just takes different forms at different times. So humans harness energy directly by way of nutrition that we take from the bounties of nature through our food production systems, and transform that into both mental energies, ways in which we can think about doing other things, and of course the energies of motion and the ability to move things. So that's the first part of the energy equation. The second part of the energy equation goes to how, in this process, we take raw materials in nature, certain forms of energy, and transform them into things that are useful, either things that we can use to transform other things, so we'll call that fixed capital or machinery, and eventually into things that we consume. Now, this is what I call the real economy of use value. So use values are things that human beings can use either to satisfy a human being's own consumption requirements, whether it's a necessity or a luxury, or it's used in the production of new things. So that's our energy transformation system in a material world. Now, the difficulty in that environment is that those processes of transformation require time and effort. And that time and effort and the resources required are mobilized in a monetary economy through the injection of credit. Right? So credit actually drives the economic system to enable ongoing accumulation to take place, initially through the processes of energy transformation, which ultimately takes money on the one hand at the beginning of a process, transforms that into different forms by way of human labour, material requirements for that human labour to reproduce, machines, the energy to make those machines move, and ultimately into final goods that humans need. And we get at the other end the completion of this cycle where the goods are sold for money. So money transforms through this material process into more money. When we do this, we are continually injecting more credit into the economic system. And that's because to fund this process, to create that liquidity to enable these transformations to take place, requires a kind of generic exchange value capability that exists separate to the final ability to transform things into use value. Now, the problem in this, so it's a necessity, but it's also a problem, is that you end up with a growth in the money supply that far exceeds ultimately the ability of the real economy of energy transformation to valorize that money supply at any moment in time. Now, this isn't an argument to go back to, fixed money rules and commodity money and those sorts of things. That's a different issue altogether. This is really about understanding two dynamics. One dynamic is material transformation through this energy transformation process. The second one is to understand how finance interacts with that. But that finance ultimately needs to find places to go to continue valorizing itself whilst the material energy transformation system does its thing. So we've actually got two connected but independent systems that operate at different rhythms. So what do we then do? Well, human beings are incredibly innovative. So we then create a new class of things that enables that money to be valorized whilst the real economy catches up, so to speak. And we call these new things fictitious capital. Now, I borrow that term from both Marx and Hayek. They both talk about fictitious capital, though not many people have since. And the idea of fictitious capital is that it is a form of exchange value, that is, it can be exchanged for something in the future, that is conditional. So money is a form of exchange value that's not conditional. You can exchange anything for money at any time. In other words, it's highly liquid, and that's one of its defining characteristics. Fictitious capital, on the other hand, is not in and of itself fully liquid, in that it can't convert to anything. It can convert to money, so you can use money to exchange it for fictitious capital. So that's a form of exchange value being exchanged for another exchange value. But the conditional nature of fictitious capital is that it makes a claim on a specific value flow in the future, either by way of an income from a capital asset, such as rent, or by way of capital growth from an asset when it's liquidated. So it's a claim on the future. And notice how it's a claim on the future that must ultimately find its source of value in the real economy. So we can actually create fictitious capital really quickly and really cheaply. Very different from what's involved in transforming energy into useful things. And over time, and we've seen this over many centuries, we go through periods where what is in effect the monetized economy gets bigger and bigger and bigger through the expansion of fictitious capital, derivatives, futures, FX, etc., as well as, of course, shares and stocks and bonds, you name it. And when you get these two circuits starting to materialize and expand, what happens? Well, at some point, the speed of circulation that's taking place in the fictitious capital space overruns the ability of the real economy. And unless you can kick that down the road through the creation of new fictitious capital, right, derivatives, refinancing, etc., you ultimately need to call it in. Right? So the real economy ultimately has to essentially settle the claim. And when you can't do that, we get financial crises, right? So this is what's going on. Now, you add spatial dimensions to this. So you asked the question about this global dynamic. So if this is happening at a domestic level, what's also happening globally is that if you do control these processes of energy transformation, industrial systems, basically, you will seek ways in which you can monetize the gains from those systems in places where you can do that either quickly, right, where production is very quick, production cycles and sales cycles are quick, and or where you can reduce the costs of the different components of doing that. And lo and behold, over the course of time, and particularly in the last 40 years, we've seen the hollowing out of energy transformation systems in the transatlantic economies. So that's your deindustrialization hollowing out problem, which takes very particular forms. In the US, it's not that output's actually dropped. The problem is actually employment. So employment in manufacturing has been totally hollowed out. And qualitatively, many of the critical upstream intermediate goods segments have also been hollowed out and they've been offshored. This has led to the expansion of global interconnected networks of supply chains. But when you're sitting there in the US as somebody whose community or a family has been displaced out of these traditional activities, at some point, if that isn't replaced by something else that you can actually do, then the frustrations boil over where the dream, the promises of the United States, for example, actually become the nightmare. So that's the dynamic that's at work. We're actually looking at the material consequences of two circuits, related but independent, where one expands quicker than the other. And as that happens, we generate political conflict.
And I guess speaking of the conflict you mentioned earlier, the underlying issue is the economy. And I've had a number of guests that sort of speak to that as well and would agree with you. And traditionally, I've had many folks like the late Johann Galtung on to talk about, the cycles of empire, the end of the U.S. empire. And often we see as when one challenger is rising, like with World War I, Britain and Germany, the empire that's in charge gets uneasy and often tends to jump the gun, I guess figuratively and literally. And we're seeing the West just going crazy. We see what's happening in Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, and NATO in particular. And you wrote a great piece recently, just published, titled "NATO's Global Ambitions: A Danger to Peace and Prosperity."
Yep.
And the first sentence you say, not satisfied with the current tragic debacle in Ukraine, NATO, as the militarized embodiment of transatlantic colonial aspiration, has now set its sight on being a global neo-colonial instrument. My skin in the game is I'm a U.S. citizen and an EU citizen, and I do believe that NATO information operations have been run against me and this podcast in the past. But I wrote a piece not long ago where we're seeing Asian NATO Think tanks have put out pieces saying Mexico should join NATO, Colombia, Argentina, Thailand, Singapore. There have been pieces saying that they should rename NATO to New Alliance Treaty Organization, because I guess the mission, they want it to go global now. And so basically, as you said, they want this to be the global sort of military security imperial force. And they're really driving into Asia now. They want South Korea to get nukes. They want Japan and Philippines to sort of integrate their military cooperation, so on. And so Australia, right? They want Australia to get nuclear submarines and all this sort of stuff. And so when it comes to the military aspect, what do you see? What's important for you? I just feel like the crazies in the West, by hook or by crook, want to bring about greater conflict. The military-industrial complex profits from that. Financial Times last week says the profits for the defense industry are off the charts. And it's also a great way, isn't it, often to reset the financial ledger when we have a global conflict?
Look, there's no doubt that the military-industrial complex profits substantially from not just warfare itself, but the talking up of the risks of warfare, right? So, but I think that there is, again, stepping back slightly, what we have is an attempt to lock down the political and institutional conditions of an existing or a recently disappearing global distributional arrangement. So as the flows of capital, the movement of these energy transformation systems have, set up shops in countries, and people in different places develop skills and knowledges to harness energy and transform it. We're also starting to, I guess, see a concern that that's leading to a radical displacement of an existing global distributional setup. And the global North, the G7 countries and their various associates have come to a view quite clearly, I think, that the distributional setup that has been of tremendous benefit to not just their economies generally, but to their elite, is under threat. And the only way to, in a sense, stem the tide is to impose a set of military enforceable arrangements that will either slow the circulation of capabilities around the world, so that we continue to deny the developing global South the ability to become capable of creating value, and at the same time, not just deny them that capability, but to bring back the capability to home. And we see that with the CHIPS Act, the various attempts to revitalize American manufacturing, actually to the expense of European manufacturing. But there is there's no friends or enemies in this particular game when you're seeking to rebuild your own manufacturing base. And the US has come to a view, it seems, that it's now or never. And there is an irony in all of that, because concerns about hollowing out in the North American economic structure have been around since the 1970s. And much of that was ignored or dismissed. And the consequences of technology advance, robotization, automation, and to some extent the impacts of trade on domestic industries has been wiped over on the basis of the aggregate benefits. But of course, the aggregate benefits of open trade have to be mediated ultimately through some kind of a domestically established distributional architecture. So if the aggregate benefits are there, but they're disproportionately benefiting a small sector, then eventually the people don't experience the benefits, and then they start to get cranky, right? And again, this is the kind of thing we've seen. And you touched on, things like AI and modern tech earlier. And I might just sort of add a little bit in on that, just to kick the discussion off, if you will. And that is that AI as a capability has a couple of interesting dimensions. One is that it's actually a great consumer of energy itself. So without energy, you don't get AI, either to manufacture the hardware that makes AI possible, but importantly, to run the processing capabilities in data centers that you need for AI to deliver its outputs. So AI itself is one of the, is an epitome, if you will, of the modern energy transformation systems that I spoke of. But AI is being harnessed also to impact impact productivity in a broad sense, which is both the speed at which you can go through these cycles of production and also the extent to which you can achieve a better ratio between energy inputted versus energy outputted, right? And so these dual movements, if you will, are now being driven by AI so that we can transform energy, harness energy, transform energy, harness raw materials, transform raw materials quicker and with a lower energy to output ratio, and also to speed the process up. So you've got to have both, right? So modern capitalism isn't just about creating more with less energy input. It's also about being able to do the whole thing quicker. Right, so you've got this dual productivity driver, process productivity or transaction productivity plus production productivity. And AI cuts right across all of that. So you'll see the difference between how economies that still have a strong productionist orientation, such as China, such as Russia, and the developing world, are harnessing AI to drive production efficiencies. Whereas in the Western world, AI is being harnessed in the name of other kinds of purposes, right? So we're starting to see in China, even if China, for example, does not have the most advanced AI in pure terms, actually has the most cost-effective AI in material economic terms. So that's where I think a lot of this is going. And it all anchors back to how we get our heads around this energy transformation system that we call the economy and how we distribute those capabilities across the world so that we don't have as chronic a problem of the countries of the haves and the countries of the have-nots.
On that note regarding tech, maybe then to discuss an article that you wrote, I think a couple months back on, for me, is fascinating, the currency of multipolarity and as well, just the underlying question of, as you mentioned, BRICS and China seem to be harnessing these new technologies, I guess, quicker or better for the moment when it comes to, I've heard you talk about Enbridge, if you could unpack some of these things for us. Enbridge, digital currencies. I've read about interoperable central bank digital currencies, DPI, as they call it, digital public infrastructure, digital identities. I mean, there's so much of this stuff going on. Bitcoin and crypto, countries, every week we're hearing a new country is legalizing the use of digital assets, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And so you talk about the changing patterns and composition of cross-border trade have long laid foundations for the emergence of currency multipolarity. And you say that this is an architecture of currency multipolarity, that this can run in parallel to the existing post-Bretton Woods US dollar dominated global financial system. And so if you could tell us a bit about how you see this all developing. Every country on the planet is developing the CBDCs, and it seems like I've been reading that the goal is to make them interoperable so you can have instant trade, instant payments, and the countries can decide, if they don't want to use the dollar for trade, they can instantly not do that.
Yeah, look, in thinking about this, we need to get our heads around ways of thinking about what money is, right? And many conventional ways of approaching this question of money view money as a thing, something with properties. And that goes back to ways in which historically we've conceptualized money in very material terms. So money has certain physical attributes and physical properties. But money in the 21st century, and in fact money going way well before this, but it's really obvious now that money in the 21st century actually speaks to relationships as opposed to being something that has physical properties. And they're relationships that ultimately enable one agent to have a claim on something of another agent. So the ability then to use money in processes of economic circulation and exchange is actually the foundation point for understanding what some of the implications are of the changing patterns of the flows of goods and services globally and what that means as far as things like the US dollar is concerned. Money is a means by which the exchange of goods and services can take place in a relatively low-cost way where the parties involved can be satisfied that they're exchanging equivalents. So that's really all it is. It's a unit of account that enables the exchange of equivalents. Once we've gotten that basic proposition in our heads, we then realise that, in fact, it's the need to circulate commodities or the need to circulate various forms of energy through this system that underpins the necessity of this thing that we call money. And if the production of these different forms of energy, different commodities, things, products, and services take place in different jurisdictions that usually enable the exchange and flow of these things within their boundaries using a particular means of notation needs to swap with those elsewhere, then they need to have a mechanism by which they can accomplish that. And now, there's no reason in principle why transacting parties actually can't facilitate those exchanges without reference to the means of exchange from some other country. There's actually no real reason why. However, globally, the system and the system of expanded trade needs to have the ability for liquidity within the system so that the actors within the system can conduct their business with confidence that at the end of the day, there's sufficient liquidity to settle the accounts of the day, particularly at a bank-to-bank level. Now, what's interesting about the global trade system, and this goes back to that original conceptual stuff that I went through with you earlier, that idea of the real economy of use value versus the economy of exchange values, is that the total value of the exchange of real value globally is $40-odd trillion a year, something like that. But to give you a sense of the proportionality of these things, the annual value of trade in FX and FX derivatives is over $12,000 trillion a year. Now, you actually don't need that amount of circulating money and money being exchanged for other forms of money and the derivatives of those things, in other words, forms of fictitious capital, to provide sufficient liquidity for the settlement of $43 trillion worth of trade. So in some regards, it is entirely conceivable that as new multilateral exchanges consolidate between numerous countries, that they will be able to trade very successfully and with sufficient liquidity using national currencies. The fact that countries are talking about national currencies is driven in part, in fact, it was driven originally not so much by the weaponization of the United States dollar, but largely by the time inefficiencies of the SWIFT-based system and the exchange rate risks that people would be exposed to by exchanging using a third-party currency, plus the costs of that. Right? So it would take too long, you had FX risk, and it was costing too much in fees. And so the movement over the last 10 years away from, or the movement towards alternative messaging systems has already taken place before sanctions actually, in a sense, put a capstone on national governments thinking around these issues, which of course now says you're best off to ensure that you are as least exposed to the risk of having your ability to transact globally controlled by a third party, to be capriciously controlled. So, we talk about it in terms of censorship-resistant ledgers, right? And let's not forget that this global network of data flows, excuse me, it takes most of this data through data centers that operate out of Virginia in North America. And by virtue of their physical location, these the data that is stored and processed through these centres is susceptible to US regulatory jurisdictional reach. And who wants that? Now, prior to the weaponisation of the US dollar over the last so many years, sanctions and asset confiscations and actually the freezing of US dollars, there wasn't a huge amount of concern. There is now. So we're going to see a hastening of this move where countries will reduce the extent to which they are exposed to these risks. But there is another interesting feature in this process, and I call it currency multipolarity rather than de-dollarization, because I think it's important to understand that in a global economic system, which is, a contained system, right? There's no insides or outsides. So the entire global economic system defines the system. The predominance of the US dollar in pure volume terms as a stock of units of account within this system means that until those dollars are absorbed and in effect burned out of the system, those dollars exist somewhere. They exist on someone's ledger, on someone's balance sheet. So whenever somebody sells dollars for something else, you've got to remember someone's buying those dollars or exchanging whatever it is that they've got for the dollars. So China, for instance, as we know, has been reducing its US dollar reserves, but it means someone else is taking them, right? So China's buying copper and soybeans and other commodities and gold and other things, but it means someone's selling those things. So the US dollars continues to exist in the global system. The question that we need to really start to think hard about is if those US dollars are progressively of less use in terms of transacting or settling the trade in goods and services, that 40-odd trillion dollars worth, then those US dollars will necessarily be drawn to this other world, which is the world of fictitious capital. But, and this is a big but, even though that world of fictitious capital, FX trading, derivatives trading, et cetera, is many, many times greater than the value of real economy value exchange, at some point, the fictitious capital must come home, what I call come home to the real economy, unless you want to keep kicking the can down the road. Now, if you want to keep kicking the can down the road, there are other implications. So you're either going to need to kick the can down the road, create more derivatives and essentially keep spinning the monetized wheels, faster and faster, or you've got to get these dollars out of the system. And the only way that the dollars can get out of the system is for the Fed to take the dollars back, right? So the Fed can only do that by selling bonds. Right? So when bonds are being issued, holders of US dollars are exchanging those dollars for bonds. The other way, of course, that the government in the United States can take the dollars out of the system is by taxing. Taxation takes money out of the system. So otherwise, over time, it is quite clear that the total stock of US dollars that has been created over all of these years within the global system will simply not be absorbable within the real economy of the global economy. And as those US dollars head back home, because it's the only place where US dollars will be unquestionably useful, the question for me is does the US economy, real economy, have the capacity to absorb this influx of US dollars? And the short answer is no, which means to overcome the inflationary risk that is inherent in this process, taxation will need to increase. So multipolarity is going to see, I think, the progressive expansion of non-US dollar denominated trade settlements in the scheme of the global economy, relatively small compared to total financial flows, but all of those financial flows that are detached from the real economy ultimately create headaches for the United States.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. Kevin O'Leary, this well-known investor, I was sent this article the other day where he came out and said, we're looking at a downsized America. And he said something that if you're in your early 20s, your lifestyle will be about 20% less. And that sort of speaks to what you're saying. I've had people like Peter Schiff and other renowned investors on the program. They've talked about hyperinflation of the dollar, which you've alluded to. So if it doesn't inflate, they're going to have to tax us more. And indeed, that's what they're looking to do. They're talking about unrealized capital gains taxes and all this sort of stuff. No.
Yeah. Look, I mean, basically, they've got to take this stock of excessive dollar liquidity out of the system, and over time, if the dollar's not being used as much for other things, then it becomes a problem, right? And I mean, the alternative, of course, is to direct those dollars into mobilizing resources that rebuild a productive economy. I mean, that's a radical idea, of course, because it means that you're starting to get back into the, get your hands dirty world of creating factories. And I don't mean dirty old factories, but new factories, AI-driven machines, automation, robotics, et cetera, that actually create things of use for people. Alternatively, you'll see a continued expansion of the fictitious capital world, of financialized instruments, transactions-driven monetization. Because your other problem, of course, is that because over time, this liquidity, this money, stock, is actually quite concentrated in the hands of a relative few, it starts to lead to asset value inflation without driving real economic growth. So, property values, stock values, these are the sorts of things that come about when you have quantitative easing, for example, and also when you have a global stock of US dollar liquidity having to come back home. And I guess that's the point that, and we're at that point now where there is a need for it to come back home. I mean, the irony, of course, is that the current US public debt is actually a way in which the system is trying to take this US dollars out of the system, right? I mean, that's part of what it's trying to do. So it's taken a huge amount of what is essentially money capital out of the system in exchange for a regular interest payment. Right? That's what they're doing. Right? So you can't get out of it totally. You've got to keep paying an interest, which puts money back into the system. But look at who owns those bonds. Right? So the money that gets put back into the system is concentrated. So this is a massive wealth transfer to the already wealthy, which feeds a political crisis. So financialization in modern American capitalism feeds the political crisis, which of course spills over into the global crisis as well.
When you say political crisis, what comes to mind for me and what I'm concerned about as a Westerner is that the rise of authoritarianism and totalitarianism in the West. I've had the Department of Homeland Security ban me from PayPal. We're seeing, I can't believe just this week in UK, in Europe, primarily in UK, people are being now arrested in their homes for thought crime. Activists, grandmas who make comments on social media. Some of my past podcast guests are awaiting trial for just for thought crime. I mean, just for posting their thoughts online that disagree with the government. We've seen what's happened in Canada, and there's just many cases in U.S. and Brazil, even here in Mexico. Again, people being arrested for thought crime, bank accounts being frozen. What do you make of this trend in the West towards greater authoritarianism?
I describe this as an autoimmune response. And it really draws on the thinking that emerged in the 1920s, actually, about the limits of liberal parliamentary democracies. And the limits of liberal parliamentary democracies were identified at the time as ones in which it created the conditions of its own internal implosion. And it happens because within a liberal environment, there are plenty of views of the world that don't subscribe to necessarily the all things good and bright about that liberal parliamentary system. And they become agitators for change. And at some point, the system sees this agitation as a threat to the system itself. The problem is that its response means that it must become more illiberal. It can only deal with the consequences of liberalism, so to speak, by becoming more illiberal in the name of defending liberalism. So what's happening now is not a surprising dynamic at all, that the liberal order has within its core architecture the seeds of its own implosion. And it implodes because it enables the emergence of potential threats to the order itself to emerge and to exist and arguably to flourish. And ironically, as we've been discussing, many of the economic policies that have been pursued and the structural dynamics that have existed within this order actually create the conditions that catalyze this adverse reaction to the system itself. So the system is creating the very things that challenge the system. And the elite layers, if you will, the establishment layers, at some point are pushed to make a decision. And the decision is to suspend liberties, right? And that moment of decision will vary from place to place and from time to time, and whatever the trigger point is will also vary. But the need to make the decision never goes away because that need is inherent in the way the system operates. And that's where we're at today. It does raise complex issues, though. So, and perhaps these issues have become more acute as social media has proliferated over the last 20-odd years. But in a, quote, post-truth world, the issues around the validity of information within a society are ones that we need to confront and have very frank discussions about, because without some basis of a common set of truths, some basis, whatever that happens to be, and it will vary from, again, civilization to civilization, culture to culture, but a society needs to have some common discourse for it to actually be able to function as something that resembles a democracy. And if we head down the pathway where large groups of people, a society, no longer have the means by which a common knowledge can exist and be sustained and be subscribed to by the overwhelming majority of people, then that society no longer has the means to function effectively as a peaceful society. And that's where we've come to in many respects. The creation of truth tribes, competing truth tribes that are funneled and fine-tuned through algorithms in social media makes it impossible often for disparate groups to have meaningful ways of identifying the common truths that might hold them together. So the divisions that emerge and the divisions that exist by virtue of differences of interests, etc., become exacerbated to a point where, lo and behold, a decision must be made to clamp down on the fragmentation that takes place because of it. So there's a whole series of interwoven dynamics that are eating away at what we've come to know as the liberal parliamentary order and the liberal economic order in the Western countries at a political level, at a cultural level, and at an economic level.
I'm jumping around a bit with my questions because there's so many things I want to ask you, but when talking about this new technology, these, multipolar currency regime, CBDCs, all this stuff is going global. It's a fact of life. I've had on a number of guests who broached the issue of some of these things becoming dystopian. I've had the renowned Jewish historian Edwin Black on, and he matter of factly he calls this the Algorithm Ghetto, and it's not particular to any country. We're seeing evidences of this. There's good and bad with any technology, but we've seen this happen in many countries around the world where, as you were saying earlier, if someone is considered a dissident in a certain country, the government can basically hit the pause button and debank them. They can't travel, they can't work. And so do you have any thoughts on, we use the term social credit type system or algorithm ghetto or whatever. And again, it's happening in many jurisdictions around the planet. Journalists like in Germany have had their bank account and their parents' bank accounts shut just for a thought crime. Do you ever think about the potential misuse of these technologies and us sort of ending up in a slightly dystopian world if we have cashless society and that sort of thing?
Look, it's easy to either be dystopian or utopian, really, because we get the boosters on both sides, don't we? One of the interesting things about all forms of governmental technologies is that they also imply pockets of slippage. They can never be implemented perfectly, number one. And number two, they also bring with them the possibilities of all sorts of resistance. Right? So there is not a power relationship that doesn't always have intrinsic to it pockets of resistances as well. Now, the issue is again, it varies from country to country. So the idea of there being, I guess, a universal single attitude towards this is, I think, a difficult one to sustain, largely because we're dealing with, I guess if I was to think this through from an ethical point of view, I would probably think this through from the perspective of the virtue ethics of Aristotle, if you will, or the idea of the golden mean from a Confucian point of view. And that is that what constitutes the right balance is a fluid proposition that can only be known at the time. And so, again, and this goes back to these issues of this sort of the downsides of this post-truth world, if you will, that the inability for a group of people to have common truths is actually a problem for the people themselves in ways that they can't directly grasp themselves until it happens, right? Which is the inability to conduct civic discourse with each other, and the joint starts to fall apart, either through political violence or attempts to purge certain groups of people. The second thing that I think is worth bearing in mind is that, and this is also, the good and the bad, if you will. You can't have good without bad. These are the sort of yin and yang coexistence issues. And that is that human societies have, from day one, functioned by means of ways of categorizing people. We necessarily do that for all sorts of reasons. And interestingly, sometimes we think those reasons are entirely legitimate, and other times we think those reasons to be entirely illegitimate. And we categorize people based on ideas of madness. We can only let the sane participate and the insane need to be quarantined. We have ways in which we categorize people as far as illnesses are concerned. We need to quarantine the sick from the healthy. We have ways in which we quarantine or segregate the fit and the able, for purposes of, criminal trials. We have ideas around a suitable age of competence to be able to be responsible for things such as voting and drinking. And of course, we've got this incredible discourse around this idea of merit. Right, that there are ways in which we categorize people as being more meritorious than others. So we have lots of ways in which we organize social and economic life by virtue of categories and placing people in them. And in fact, most of the time, across all societies, we tend to accept most of those categorizations. And I'll give you a very concrete example where categorization actually opens up all sorts of issues, and yet it has been taken in its stride in the United States, and that is the ways in which prospective rental tenants are categorized, and landlords can purchase data on prospective tenants, not only about their previous rent payment practices, which is what you'd think would be the main thing that a landlord, would be concerned about, but also the data scrapes the person's social media trails to provide a picture of the kind of person this prospective tenant is. All of this data is available today at the price that people are willing to pay for it. And in the United States, that is actually part and parcel of a legitimate way in which we inform landlords about prospective tenants. And yet it opens up all the questions about privacy, confidentiality, whether in fact the metrics are the right ones or not, and why does it matter whether somebody attended some demonstration or participated in some civil protest or not, right? Why does that matter in terms of them being a good tenant, right? So that little can of worms opens up the problems that modern societies are now confronting. It's easy to sit back and have a general view about privacy, but it actually doesn't inform us in terms of what we need to do to address the issues at stake. It's easy to have a general view about censorship and freedom of speech, but it's more complex when that issue hits the ground, when clearly there are mistruths or untruths that are propagated in the name of freedom of speech. And there are times where this conduct doesn't matter that much, but then there are times where it does matter a lot to considerations such as the individual liberties of the victims of hate speech, right? So it's one thing to say freedom of speech important and somebody's right to be able to say what they think shouldn't be impeded. Yet, of course, in a practical context, if you're the victim of hate speech that mobilizes groups of people against you, resulting in ostracism or, in fact, violence against you and your friends and your family, then there are consequences that a society needs to come to grips with. These are very difficult issues, and 2024, in some respects, has just thrown them all at us as members of societies, as global citizens, but also as citizens of individual countries. They're actually not easy things. And I think that we're going to see far more trouble around these issues before a new settlement is achieved around what a new consensus will look like for different societies.
Yeah, we see many examples. Pavel Durov of Telegram being arrested by French authorities. What's happening with Elon Musk in Brazil. Let me then just ask you: how do you see the future? This new, I guess, system that we're transitioning into. My feeling, it just seems that overall the West, the economic well-being will be declining for Westerners in many Western countries. In the global South, here in Mexico and in the BRICS countries, things will be relatively improving. What's your sort of forecast for the future when it comes to East and West?
Look, I think that there is both a question of relative decline and absolute decline, and the questions of absolute decline are unevenly distributed. And this is where political anxieties will continue to become exacerbated in Western societies that have for many centuries become quite comfortable with their position in the global pecking order, and where domestic inequalities, in a sense, have been effectively masked by the fact that there has been overall wealth creation. So I think we're going to start to see increasing political tensions emerge in Western countries as they come to grips with the fallout from the displacement of the colonial order of things. From an elite point of view, it leads to chronic anxieties, right? So we're seeing those anxieties play out in all sorts of responses, typically defensive responses as far as economic policies are concerned, and militarily aggressive responses as a means of trying to quell what is perceived to be the threat. The challenge for the global majority, or the rest, is to navigate this turbulent environment without taking the bait. And that's going to be a very difficult thing to do, because the bait that is being laid isn't just at the explicit level of sanctions and punitive economic measures, and in some parts of the world, an increased deployment of military effort to generate military tensions. I think one of the interesting and potentially highly disruptive parts of the next 10 years or so is going to be the extent to which the West will seek to engineer domestic instabilities in countries around the world. So regime change operations, colour revolutions, call it whatever you will. But I think that is the level at which a lot of this anxiety is going to be played out through. And And we are seeing elements of that already, whether it's in Brazil, Venezuela, Georgia, Ukraine, of course, the attempts at regime change on and off in Russia, the attempts to destabilize China at its peripheries, either in Hong Kong itself or in Myanmar, Thailand, the Taiwan Straits, the Philippines. So there is the general bigger picture pattern is going to involve, in part, a colour revolution style of politics, of global politics, that will actually lead to a few things. One is a clamping down of liberties, of course, in countries around the world. That's one. Now, there will be, I think, some interesting things come out of that. And if I remember, I'll come back to it. But clamping down will be one. It will also, I think, lead to greater nationalism, if you will, as countries rely upon nationalistic sentiments as part of their defence. Now, rising nationalism brings with it some potentially quite dangerous features as well. And that, like all things, I'm very oriental, if you will, in my broad philosophical views of the world, and that is that good and bad actually exist. Big and small exist, and they must coexist. And so it's quite dialectic. But I think that this issue of regime change, domestic nationalism, national stabilization, this return to sovereignty, which is one of the features of the multipolar world, this general discourse around sovereignty, are going to play huge parts. Now, what's the downside? One of the key downsides, of course, is that as sovereignties reassert themselves, they find it harder and harder to interact with others. That's the downside risk. And I think the emerging multipolar world is seeking to carve out new ways in which sovereignty coexists with enhanced interoperability. Right. Now, that's the challenge. And the challenge, for example, in the digital realm, will be through what I've called digital Westphalia will begin to look like. So the idea of American technologies being the de facto global technology standard will become a thing of the past. And that's not to say that countries don't want to be able to interact with those technologies. They do, because they see no reason to not be interacting with others using it. They see no reason to not be interacting with the United States, which is, one of the world's largest economies. It has incredible influence in the world, lots of people, and there's lots of good reasons to be interacting with good people doing amazing things in the United States. But they're not going to do it through a technology architecture that leaves them exposed to the destabilization that can come from interventions from external forces in your digital information landscape. So digital Westphalia will see the emergence of sovereign competencies around operating systems that are generic, open source and universal, upon which digitally sovereign architectures are built. And that's the evolution, if you will, that I think we're going to start to see from organizations like BRICS and others. And we can do that not because we have to do any of this stuff from scratch, but because we actually have the heft in organizations, technology organizations in China, Russia and other parts of the world, who are now rolling out the alternative open source architectures on the back of the existing open source work that's been done over the last 3 decades globally. Open source was always a reaction to, big tech domination. But open source was also very and I don't mean this in a negative sense, but it was always a little bit hobby-like. It didn't have that critical mass, the heft that you need, footprint-wise, development support, resourcing, you name it. But when you've got Chinese software companies now committing themselves to open source communities, the heft will come. And the opportunity for the global rest will be to skill up and make use of this new operating environment to build the digital architectures that delivers both digital sovereignty on the one hand and enhanced cryptographically supported interoperability on the other.
Something that came to mind when you were talking about color revolutions in countries clamping down. Initially, it was I lived in Kazakhstan. My master's thesis I wrote on color revolutions, and I had been warning the Kazakh government I actually came into some of my students were working with foreign sponsored NGOs. They were actually sponsored by USAID, Open Society, and any National Endowment for Democracy. And I actually had a meeting. They came to me, the Kazakh internal security, and I was warning them about this. And there has to be a nuance here, because at times the Kazakh government would shut down social media, but that's because the empire was trying to regime change them. So it's like, what do? You're between two bad options. It's like people complain, my internet, my private email service is banned in Kazakhstan. I had to go through a number of VPNs. And then we saw in January 2022 this attempt at a color revolution that failed. And so there's not a simple equation there. And I guess one of my final questions for you is, do you feel that the opinions of people around the world are changing? Are we reaching a turning point when it comes to American empire, Western hegemony? Are people getting tired finally around the world of being bullied by Pax Americana?
Yes, is the short answer. And look, people have been tired of colonialism for centuries, but they didn't have the means to necessarily confront it. And I guess the sense of courage and capacity to confront it has re-emerged in the course of, the last 20 years. And in large part, I would argue, it has been made possible by the growth of China. Now, that isn't the only factor. And of course, we've seen the re-emergence of Russia as a great power, where Russia is taking on the American empire in ways that arguably the Chinese wouldn't do, right? So a very different methodology, if you will, and a mindset to how to address these issues. But all of this sends a very clear signal around the world, and that is that you are no longer alone. There are those with the capacity to back you up, and you can no longer be sanctioned with impunity because you always have somewhere to come. And the more the sanctions economically and politically are used as ways of punishing dissident countries, the more likely they are to find themselves embracing this multipolar alternative that is evolving around the BRICS, the SCO, and those sorts of organizations that in many respects are actually far less judgmental about what it is that they each think the good life should be, but literally say, whatever you think the good life should be, that's a matter for you, just as it is a matter for us. And that's where if there is a silver lining at the moment in this current stage of, incredible flux, it is exactly that there is the courage to be open to creating the new possibilities. And I also get the sense that when people have this attitude, and of course there's a spectrum of views, of course, on this, but a lot of the people that I speak to, they, of course, harbour great anger about historical conditions. But at the same time, very few of them hold the view that to solve those gripes requires retribution. In fact, quite the opposite. The view is that, you know what, there's a big round table here of humanity, and there's a seat at this table for everybody, including those who've been, the worst of the colonial expropriators. But they need to understand that the table is round, and they need to bring something to the table that they can share with everyone else at the table. And when they can do that, they're very welcome at this banquet, and be responsible as a contributor to this global banquet. So that's the sense that I get. People want to protect themselves from the bullying, from the sanctions and the capricious interventions, but they don't want to deny the opportunity for the colonial countries to actually contribute to the world in constructive ways. They're a little bit beyond that. And so, again, I often say that as tempting as it is to react in an understandably angry way, the task before us is actually to see this through. We've just got to see it through, because at the other end of this is not nirvana, I might add. It's just a multipolar world where countries will have their differences, but they are compelled to tackle those differences in a way that doesn't involve a kinetic reaction as your first recourse. And if we can get to that point, then we've got a chance of a slightly more peaceful multipolar world.
Not with nukes flying. And what you just described, people ask me, how do Mexicans feel regarding the U.S. and U.S. empire? And I would actually say, as you described, many Mexicans, they'll grumble about certain things, but they actually, by and large, like America. They're consumers of so much American entertainment and goods and services. That we got here, the Amazons and the Costcos and the Starbucks, and people travel to shop in the U.S. And so I think Mexicans espouse that attitude towards the U.S. But as you say, especially the outgoing president AMLO now, he makes firm that we don't want interference. We want to be respected, so on and so forth. It's been a fantastic, wide-ranging conversation. Warwick, if you have any final thought, and then if you want to let us know where people can best find you, your projects, and so forth.
Yeah, look, I think that, thanks again for having me. It has been very wide-ranging, and one of the challenges with trying to pull all of these threads together is to, have some clever, pithy ways of summarizing things. And, I wish I had some of that, but I think that we are clearly going through a period of tremendous turbulence. It is operating at many levels. Fundamentally, for mine, the critical drivers are economic transition. One thing we didn't touch on today is actually this sense of this millenarian zealotry that underpins a lot of the American project in particular, which is the idea of exceptionalism that isn't just simply about being the greatest and the best, but that in fact the greatest and the best is a God-ordained greatest and best. And that brings with it, I think, some quite unique features as far as that belief in obligation and right to civilize the barbarians and to intervene where appropriate. So economic change coupled with this millenarian zealotry is a very, very dangerous mix in the middle of the 2020s. The challenge for multipolarity is to cope with the fact that the dominant systemic players will lash out, that the establishment in these countries will seek to regain primacy and will seek to stymie the efforts to enhance multipolarity. And wherever we can, we have to be able to respond with a clear focus on what the outcome is. And the outcome is a fairer economic global system. And that means investment and trade and flow of know-how. And at the same time, a respect for civilizational and national difference and sovereignty. And if we can work our way towards that as people, and to express our desires for ongoing non-violent ways of resolving differences, so that you mentioned Johann Galtung before, right? Now, he made a very important distinction. I'll probably just end on this note. And his distinction was between this idea of negative peace, which is the avoidance of military conflict, and positive peace, which is a much deeper set of interrelationships. And I think what we've got to work towards is the idea that we must create institutions and practices that support the creation of positive peace, rather than merely pursue an arms race in the name of avoiding military conflict, which is nothing more than a negative peace that kicks the can down the road. So I might leave it on that note. You can find my stuff, by the way, Warwick Powell, Substack. That's probably the best place, and because I normally provide links to things from there.
All right, all your links are in the description to your X feed, which is a great resource. Your Substack, and as well as your publications. I discovered, I think, through you, the Taihei Institute Observer, which also is a must read. From we need to be reading from a wide range of material. Russia, China, the West, to sort of formulate a good opinion of what's going on. And thank you for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Absolute pleasure.